All right, well, welcome. Today we're going to be turning the corner and talking a little bit about this book, What Money Can't Buy, by Michael Sandel. It's a book that's essentially classified as a philosophy book, but it's not one where you have to know a lot about the history of ideas or the history of philosophy in order for it to make sense to you. It's essentially a book, I think, written for people who are, lay philosophers, if you will, people who aren't, people who write or talk about philosophy seriously. And most of the items that he talks about have to do with the observations and comments that he's making about society at large. And the author's name is a gentleman by the name of Michael Sandel, who, if you are not familiar with him, he's a professor of business and ethics philosophy at Harvard. He has kind of a celebrity status among philosophers, at least. If you go onto YouTube and you do a search on his name, you'll find many different videos of talks that he's given, oftentimes on topics that are very similar to what this book is about. His classes at Harvard are extremely popular. I've heard that the wait list to get in them is years long. So, he's somebody who has quite a reputation amongst philosophers and very popular on Harvard's campus. And the main idea in this book, which he essentially asserts at the beginning, and then, continues to show many different examples throughout, different areas of the economy and different kinds of social situations, is one that is, I think, at the heart of what some would say one of the major dilemmas in American society today, which is we have a problem with how we value things and what kind of values we should attach. Essentially, in this book, the subtitle of it is The Moral Limits of Markets. He's basically talking about how we have one kind of sphere that we deal with, which is called the moral sphere, or how we assess value based on what we think is good or bad, or what we prefer, or what is moral and what is immoral. And this, sphere operates amongst itself. It's a kind of, working system that you might think religious systems might be based on, for lack of a better example. That's just one kind of example. Obviously, moral decisions are made in our society amongst all different kinds of people for all different kinds of reasons. And he contrasts that to then the economic sphere, or the market sphere in case of American society, where value is essentially attached according to the price of a particular service or commodity that allows it to have a certain kind of value that oftentimes when you bring these two spheres together, they come into conflict, or there's some sort of contrast. And Sandel is asking the question whether, we should value one over the other. How do these two kinds of systems interact? And, he has a certain number of insights. Namely, I think one of his main premises in the book is that unless we take into consideration the moral sphere and don't just take it for granted that it's out there and, well, who cares about it, and dismiss our religious underpinnings, if you will, or whatever moral underpinnings and whatever endeavor you're taking a look at, that invariably the values of the market, i.e. the dollar values that we place on something, the incentives that are placed within markets, they tend to take over and displace the moral values. And it's only with our repeated interest and concern and discussion over what is moral do moral values have any chance of surviving the continual onslaught of the economic sphere pressing against them and pushing those moral limits further and further back from where they were before. And to keep things simple for today, I'm going to talk about one example that he mentions at the beginning of the book, and that's the issue of lines and line standings. He talks about professional line standers. In particular, in Washington, people who are lobbyists, for example, who are too busy to stand in line to go and get a ticket for a particular congressional hearing or whatever kind of public venue. I mean, these are all public venues that we're talking about here. These are not private events. They're too busy, so they hire somebody in a service somewhere to go stand in line, to go get a ticket, or to gain access to whatever congressional hearing or government meeting that they might want to attend. And as a result, then that line stander gives the ticket to the person who is the interested party, and then the interested party pays the person who has been standing in line for them. And the idea here that Sandel wants to put across is that, hey, what happened to first come, first serve? A sense of fair play, a sense of a kind of egalitarian access to an event or a public event like this. Aren't we, as all citizens, presumably equal from the very first moment such an event is announced to be able to attend? And what Sandel says is, with services like this, which most people don't object to per se, because they say, hey, well, the market says that it will bear a price and people are willing to do this, hey, everybody wins, okay? But he's saying, well, maybe what's the big loser is our sense of, this moral sphere and how our egalitarian standards become eroded a little bit. And how when you see this type of thing happening, you start to say, oh, wow, geez, I can't afford X amount of dollars to go pay somebody to stand in line for me. So that makes me feel kind of like a second-class citizen. And then you get a kind of enmity and a kind of irritation at large about, the society that you're participating in, and how you don't have the same kind of access or equal access as somebody else. And that starts to erode public trust, a sense of the commonwealth, that we're all in it together, etc., etc. It gets back to some of the questions that people are asking more and more today about is, what is undermining the sense of unity within American society? Well, I think Sandel would at least go some way to argue it's this sense that, because money buys access, or it can in many cases, it tends to have us, disbelieve that we're full and equal partners in this thing that we call, American society. And, some people resent that. Some people say, that's just the way markets work, and such is life. Because I think it's important to take into consideration that markets by themselves are naturally and inherently discriminatory because of the various different price points that exist within markets. Within any market, let's talk about buying a car, right? You have an entry-level, economy car that's at the very bottom of the price, continuum. And then you have maybe mid-sized cars, luxury cars, high-performance cars, and, super exclusive cars that are at the very top. Each one of these represents a kind of gateway or barrier to access on the part of people who are in that society in terms of whether they can buy, a luxury car at 40, 50, 60K a pop. And if you can't, that means essentially you are discriminated against and you cannot participate in that level of the market. But almost every area of every market that you see, it starts to become more complex after a while, and you do have many different price points that develop. And as a result, you have many different ways in which society at large starts to become segmented. And you start to realize that you're only going to be at this level of society, and there's all these people up here who are going to be able to plug into the market at a much higher level and value. Now, Sandel says, okay, well, that's fine, that's the way markets work, but what happens when they come into contact with our basic sense of fair play? And with the case of the line standing, I think he wants to make the case that, hey, what happened to the old expression, patience is a virtue? You stand in line, you wait your turn, you move up a little bit by little bit, like you do at lines at Christmas, like you do with any kind of major event where you might be standing in line to get tickets. But the fact that you got there first and you were willing to plan ahead and make the effort to do so, isn't that worth something? Or is it, should we always defer to somebody who's got the deeper pocket and can afford to pay for cutting to get access ahead of you? And of course, that's one of the places that this particular book goes in this section too, is, well, what about, and that students oftentimes are familiar with, what about amusement parks? Aren't we seeing this kind of thing in place there? And of course, Sandel uses this in the book in the first section as well, as, you can pay for the Fast Pass and you can go and get the opportunity to cut in front of people at Disneyland or Disney World who might have been sitting there for a ride for a half an hour, 2 hours sometimes. But because you bought, this premium pass, it gives you the ability to cut in line, so to speak. Is that fair? Well, for some people, if the market says so and market dictates, then we shan't ever, question the market, because the market is always right. But people who believe in a sense of a different sense of preference and value might say, let's wait a second here. What really is operating here? Are we just farming this out to the people who are going to be the richest among us? And do they always have to have exclusive and better access than everybody else? So that's, in a nutshell, where he's talking about at the very beginning. He even starts to talk about the difference between public and private, right? Public events, most people say, that's problematic because everybody should have access. Well, what about private events? Is it okay or better for somebody to pay, for example, to get a table ahead of you at a restaurant, even though you've been waiting there for 25 minutes? And somebody walks in and he's a big roller and he lays out a $50 bill and boom, he gets the table right next to the window, and you're like, hey, wait a second, I've been here for half an hour. But these kinds of things happen, and they're minor irritations. For most part, we put up with it until they start to add up, and then I think for many people there's a sense that it degrades our sense of that society really is playing fair, and that if you have money, that you're always going to be given some sort of favoritism. So that's what we're talking about in this book. The assignment, very briefly, for this paper is the idea that I want you to take a look at something as it becomes commoditized, or as a market starts to get attached to it. And there'll be several different examples of this. The line standing one is a good example, where just a couple of years ago this kind of thing didn't exist. Now that it does, and there's been a market built up around it, how does that change how people regard the item that you're talking about? Do people think more favorably about it? In Sandel's opinion, most of the time people's opinions become degraded and they become diminished. They think lesser of it. And also they think lesser of the society that allows it to happen. But sometimes, when we attach market values, people actually think better of it, because, if something's more expensive, it's usually better, right? That's a debatable point all in itself, but that belongs to the economic sphere, and I'm going to leave that out of it. For right now, I want you to take a look at something that newly has become a market item, it's commodity, and start to think, well, how has the valuation of that thing changed? Positive, negative, can we use other words to describe how the valuation has changed? Take a look around you, and I think you'll start to see many different examples once you start to think about this topic as you read the book, of how money encroaches on our moral sphere, how market encroaches on the moral sphere. That's it. Enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Take care.